And when we talk about their environment, we're talking about things that are both living and non-living. So when we think about living things, we think about all of those different species of plants interacting with each other, maybe sometimes helping each other, maybe sometimes hurting each other. And we can also think about animals and insects as either eating those plants or maybe helping those plants move their pollen around or distribute their fruits and their seeds. And then we can think about those non-living aspects of the environment, like the weather. So how sunny is it? How hot is it? How much rain does it get? Um, and similar to weather, we can think about shading. So how much of that light and how much of that rain is actually making it to the ground? Is a lot of it being blocked out by trees, or is it really open, like in this grassland? So we can think of the sun and the water being pretty evenly distributed across this landscape. And then we can look down to the soil. We can think about all the organisms that live in the soil, all those bugs and worms. And we can also think about the type of soil. So how much sand is there? How much clay is there? How much water do we find? How many nutrients do we find? All of these things can influence where we see plants and animals, and we can see how it influences how they interact with each other. So now let's add on the urban component. So it's still looking at the relationships of plants and animals that have with each other and their environment. But now we're going to add humans and all of the things that humans do into the mix, right? So we can see a lot of those same prairie and grassland species. We see the trees, but their distribution is a lot different. We see a lot fewer of them. They are clumped closer together, and we don't see them throughout the landscape as commonly as we did before. And then we can think about the environment and what's different about urban environments and different about cities. So now, instead of shading from trees, we have shading from buildings. We can see the landscape is broken up by fences and pavement. Not only is there sunlight, but there are also street lights. So some of these plants and animals experience light all day and also all night. And then there's also cars and humans contributing to noise and pollution. A lot of novel sounds can also influence how we see the distribution of plants and animals. So now that we know what urban ecology is, let's talk about what we've learned from urban ecology. What have we learned by studying cities? What we've learned is that cities are a lot harder than their surrounding areas. And you might have heard this referred to as the urban heat island effect, where cities are sort of like a hot bubble. And as we move farther from cities, it gets cooler. And the reason that cities are so much hotter is because there are so many more buildings and pavement, a lot of these dark surfaces that are impervious, and they absorb a lot of that heat as opposed to reflecting it back. We also know that cities have a lot more air pollutants, in particular the particulate air pollutants, so really small particles in the air that can particularly be stressful to people with asthma. This comes from a lot of industry, a lot of cars contributing to air pollution. But what we've learned is that if we increase the amount of trees, if we increase the tree canopy cover in urban areas, we can actually reduce the air temperature. We can also reduce air pollutants, and that is happening in a few different ways. So one, trees just provide shade. That helps reduce the air temperatures below them. But we also know that trees are plants, so they're photosynthesizing, they're making their own food. They're moving carbon dioxide and water in and out of their stomata, their little pores on their leaves. And that can help with cooling through a process called evapotranspiration. And that movement of water and air also helps cool things down. We also know that these cities have a lot of impervious surfaces, which not only contribute to the urban heat island effect, but also increase our risk of flooding. Um, Water tends to just run straight off of these surfaces because it can't seep through them. So these urban rain gardens that have been installed in a lot of cities, this one is actually on Michigan Ave in Lansing, can help reduce that amount of runoff, and it can also help by filtering that water and slowing it down. So instead of the water being moved to storm drains and then right into our major bodies of water nearby, like our streams and our rivers, the water actually moves through these urban rain gardens first, and that water is slowed down. It can either be taken up by the plants or moved through the soil more slowly. And that helps reduce our risk of flooding. It helps reduce our stormwater runoff, and it helps clean the water before it makes its way into our larger watershed. We also know that community gardens are really important in green spaces, in urban areas. We know that they help attract pollinators, and pollinators are animals and insects that help move pollen around to the different plants. So it helps plants develop their fruits and their seeds. And these are really important, not just for us to produce really healthy foods and things that we like to eat, but they also help all the animals and the insects, even more so than other urban green spaces like parks, our front and backyards, and even cemeteries. So now that we know what urban ecology is, we know what we've heard some things that urban ecology has taught us. You might be wondering, what do I actually study? So I study a few things. I like to ask the question of, what is it about urban areas that limit what plants can come into cities and actually thrive in cities? So I do this in a few ways. I go and I visit and I count and I identify all the plant species that are present in urban grassland plantings or restorations throughout southern Michigan. So if you saw a girl in a field with a clipboard this summer in Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, or Ann Arbor, it was probably me counting what plants I saw. And I'm going to use what I've learned from doing those surveys and use what I know about how those restorations or those plantings were done, what the surrounding landscape looks like, and what has been done to maintain these sites to understand why we see the plants there that we do. Another thing that I'm going to be doing is testing the effect of salt. So think about road salt, especially in the winter, and how that affects plant community establishment. So we know that there's a lot of weird things about urban environments, right? We know they're hotter. We know that they have a lot of runoff from storm water, right? We know that there's not as many plants and there's not as many pollinators. But we also know that there's an increased amount of salt in these environments, and especially in environments that are not adapted to salt. So think about Michigan being surrounded by lakes as opposed to surrounded by oceans. This increase in salt might be really important for what plants are able to establish or grow in these urban environments. Another way that I study urban ecology is by partnering with other researchers. So I am part of this study called the Study of Active Neighborhoods Detroit. And this is a large collaborative research project with people from Michigan State, Detroit Audubon, and the City of Detroit Parks and Rec Department. And this project is designed to understand how we can improve parks and improve the natural environment in Detroit, and how that improvement can also change the neighborhood and also have an effect on the people, the plants, and the bird species in the area. So this is happening in several different neighborhoods throughout Detroit. And a lot of that grassland planting is actually happening this summer. So it's pretty exciting. Another way that I'm planning on studying urban ecology is by studying methods for expanding the amount of natural areas in urban environments. So I'm doing this by setting up a lot of small-scale prairie restoration gardens across the Lansing area, because I want to understand how the environment affects which plant species can grow. So a really common way that we install these native plantings across cities is by starting from seed. So I want to understand what about these urban environments affects how we can go from seed to a full-grown plant community. And if this sounds like something that you're interested in getting involved with, send me an email. I'm looking for yards, parks, any green space that you have access to. Let me know. I want to put a prairie there. And with that, I would like to thank some people who have been really helpful so far with my studies at Michigan State, which is my lab group, and in particular, my advisor, Lars Bredvig. Also, my collaborators for this project stand, the MSU Science Fest team for giving me this platform. And then I have some funding people to thank. So I was funded by the Plant Sciences Fellowship Committee, and I'm also being funded by the STAND project. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, that was great, Emily. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A, or if you're joining us on Facebook, be sure to type them in. I guess I can start. What got you interested in urban ecology? Like, what motivated you to get into this field?
Sure. So when I was in undergrad, I was able to work with a graduate student that was studying urban forests in New York City. So I got to help go and visit the parks and the forests in New York City. So like in Manhattan and the Bronx. And then also they were comparing these urban forests with more rural forests in more upstate New York. And I just really enjoyed the field aspect of the ecology. And I thought that urban environments were really interesting. And there's a lot of open questions. A lot of what we know about ecology comes from studying these more pristine or natural, more rural conditions. So it's interesting to try and apply this classically developed ecological theory to these really weird and novel urban environments. Are there large prairies in Michigan? So actually, prairies and grasslands are some of the most degraded ecosystems in the world. So I think that there's only a very small percentage of grasslands left in the Midwest. Depends on what you mean by large. I know of mostly urban prairies, and they're less than an acre to several acres in size. How do you plant a prairie plant? Depends. You can start them from seed. Usually we spread seed in the fall, and then we allow the seed to sit on the soil over winter, and then it'll germinate in the spring. You can also find a native plant producer, and you can usually buy young plants from them, and you can plant them in your yard. Usually preferably a sunny spot. When studying the environment and its variability, how do urban ecologists discern timelines for research? So this is sort of an issue in ecology in general. So a lot of research is done through funding from grants, which are usually 3 to 5 years, or conducted by graduate students who usually do this work for 3 to 5 years. So these long-term studies are really, really important for ecology, but they're really hard to do, and they're really hard to get funding for. So there's a few really notable long-term studies, one being in the Southeast. It's called the Corridor Project, and that's been running for about 30 years. But a lot of research does tend to happen on these shorter term timelines of about 3 to 5 years. So ecological questions can be asked on all kinds of timelines. It sort of depends on your study question and your funding and, you know, where you are in your career path. Oh, yes. So I'm looking for a 5 by 5 meter area, so about 16 foot by 16 foot. So hopefully not too big, but depends on the size of your yard, I guess. So not necessarily just urban, but I am looking for the Lansing area. So Lansing City proper, East Lansing, Okemos, Hazlet, anything that's sort of within that Lansing metro area is what I'm looking for. Are commercial prairie plants native? What should I look for? So if you can find out which species are native to prairies. A really great resource is actually the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. They are part of MSU Extension, and they are really good at developing plant lists for different plant community types and ecosystems. A lot of nurseries in the Michigan Midwest area source their seed for native plants from wild populations. So if it's a prairie species and not a cultivar of a prairie species, then you should be good to go. Sometimes these cultivars or these horticultural or ornamental varieties are not always the best for that community type, but anything native is always good. That's my mom.
I guess I have another question. What do you think your field kind of looks like in general in the future? Like, what, after you kind of understand what's happening in these like urban prairie, what would the next step be?
Sure. So I focus a lot on restoration ecology. So how do we reestablish these native community types in urban areas? Urban ecology and restoration ecology are both fairly young fields in terms of science. They're both about 30-ish years old scientifically. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. And there's a lot of unpredictability still in what restorations will be successful. What does successful mean? And how do we know, how do we design these restorations in a way that we know what outcome we'll get before we start? So hopefully that is the future, being able to understand how to restore these communities in a predictable way. Well, if there are no other questions, then I'll just remind everyone that if you have a backyard in the Lansing area and you would like a prairie in it, send me an email. My email is conwaye2@msu.edu. If there are no other questions, then thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. Be sure to check out MSU Science Festival events coming up and check out sciencefestival.msu.edu. Thanks for joining us.